Egypt grew along the Nile, with pyramids, papyrus, calendars, and pharaohs. China grew along great rivers, developing oracle writing, jade craft, bronze vessels, dynasties, and the Silk Route.
Section 14. Egyptian Civilization. Egypt, an early civilization. Now we journey to the land of the pyramids, Egypt, one of the earliest civilizations in the world. It is famous for its rich historical records and its lasting influence on later civilizations. So Egypt is not only ancient, it is also one of the best documented of all early civilizations. Known to Greeks and Romans. Egypt was so remarkable that even the Greeks and Romans knew about it. The Greek writer Herodotus visited and wrote about Egypt as early as the 5th century BCE, and a 19th century collection called De l'Égypte also gives fascinating details of its history. So Egypt has fascinated visitors and scholars for thousands of years. Papyrus records. Much of Egyptian history is reconstructed from papyrus records, a kind of ancient paper. These documents preserve both stories and practical details, giving us a real window into how Egyptians understood their world. So, papyrus is to Egypt what clay tablets were to Mesopotamia, their main writing material. Papyrus defined. Let us understand what papyrus was. It was made by cutting the inner trunk of the papyrus plant into strips, then crisscrossing, pressing, drying, and polishing them into smooth sheets. As an example, the famous Papyrus Ebers listed more than 700 cures and spells of Egyptian medicine. So papyrus not only recorded stories, it even preserved ancient medical knowledge. Libraries and stories. Here is a delightful fact. Egyptian libraries dating back to about 2000 BCE stored papyrus scrolls in labeled jars on shelves. One such jar held the oldest version of Sinbad the Sailor. Their stories were wonderfully varied: animal fables, hinting at a link to Aesop's fables, tales of ghosts and miracles, romances, and even the oldest known form of Cinderella. So many stories we still love today have their roots in ancient Egypt. Rosetta Stone and decipherment. How was the mysterious Egyptian script finally read? Through the famous Rosetta Stone, found in 1799 by a French army engineer. This stone carried the same message in 3 scripts, including Greek, which people could still read. It was like a built-in dictionary for a lost language. Using it, the French scholar Jean-François Champollion finally deciphered the Egyptian script in 1822. So, one lucky stone unlocked an entire civilization's writing. The Egyptian calendar. The Egyptians created a clever calendar with 3 seasons, each of 4 months. It was based on the rising of the star Sirius, the dog star. Their year had 365 days, 12 months of 30 days plus 5 extra days, which is very close to correct, though it lost a little time because the true year is about a quarter day longer. So the Egyptians were skilled observers of the sky, and our own 365-day year echoes theirs. The River Nile and inundation. Egyptian city-states emerged around 3000 BCE as population and resources grew. And the secret behind it all was the River Nile. Every summer the Nile flooded, an event called the inundation, leaving behind rich black mud called kemet, excellent for growing crops. So, just like in other civilizations, a great river was the giver of life. Kemet defined. In fact, the Egyptians called their own land Kemet, which means the black. And why? Because of the black, fertile soil left by the Nile's floods. So the Egyptians named their country after the life-giving black earth, a beautiful reminder of how central the river was to them. Ditches and the calendar. About 5,000 years ago, Egyptian farmers made a clever discovery. By digging ditches, they could divert Nile water into their fields and store it in reservoirs for later use. And by counting the days between the Nile floods, they developed their calendar. So practical needs, water and farming, directly gave birth to Egyptian science. Cooperation, local government. Now think about this. Digging ditches and building dams could not be done alone. It needed the collective effort of many people. These early cooperative efforts led to the growth of local government and the rise of an administrative class to organize the work. So managing the river actually created the first forms of organized government in Egypt. Pharaohs, mastabas, and pyramids. Over time, powerful rulers called pharaohs emerged. When a pharaoh died, he was buried underground, and a rectangular structure called a mastaba was placed over the burial chamber. Gradually, people began stacking mastabas one on top of another, and this is how the pyramid was born. So the mighty pyramid grew, step by step, from a simple flat tomb. Step pyramid at Saqqara. A prominent early example is the step pyramid at Saqqara. It clearly shows this stacked, stepped form, like giant steps rising to the sky. So Saqqara is the perfect place to see how the pyramid idea first took shape. Ka and mummification belief. But why did the Egyptians build these enormous tombs? Because they believed each person had a ka, a spiritual double, that lived on after death, but only if the body was preserved. And how did they preserve the body? Through mummification. So the pyramids and mummies both spring from one powerful belief: life after death. Mummification defined. Let us understand mummification. It was the process of preserving a dead body. The internal organs, except the heart, were removed, and the body was dried with natron, a natural salt. Then it was oiled, wrapped in linen strips, placed in a coffin, and buried with rituals. So mummification was a careful, sacred process meant to keep the body ready for the afterlife. Social hierarchy. Egyptian society was shaped like a pyramid of classes. At the very top sat the pharaoh. Below him came government officials, nobles, and priests. Then free landholders, artisans, and merchants, and at the bottom, serfs and slaves. So the higher you were on this pyramid, the more power and comfort you enjoyed. A clear social hierarchy, just like in Mesopotamia. Leisure and festivals. But life was not all work. The Egyptians also enjoyed leisure. They swam, canoed, played board games, and loved music and dancing. Festivals were central to their culture, honoring the gods and the pharaoh. For example, the Sed festival celebrated a king's 30th year on the throne. So these grand celebrations showed the people's deep respect for their gods and rulers. Rights of Egyptian women. Here is a progressive fact worth remembering. Egyptian women generally enjoyed more rights than women in Greece or Rome. They could own property and run businesses. A famous example is Cleopatra, who was trained from childhood to rule and became queen at the age of 18. So in the matter of women's rights, ancient Egypt was quite ahead of its time. Chinese civilization. Rivers of China. Finally, we come to the Chinese civilization, which, you guessed it, also grew along rivers, the Huanghe, Yellow River, and the Yangtze. These two river valleys nurtured the earliest Chinese cultures. So the same great truth appears once more: rivers give birth to civilization. 161. Neolithic cultures. Approximately 7000 BCE. These river valleys were home to early Chinese Neolithic cultures dating to around 7000 BCE. In other words, Farming settlements appeared here very early, just as they did in India and West Asia. So China's story, too, begins with the Neolithic farmers. Bronze Age and First Cities. Around 2000 BCE, the arrival of copper-bronze metallurgy pushed many Neolithic settlements, especially in the Yellow River Basin, towards the Bronze Age. But urban centers, cities, truly began to emerge only around 1600 BCE, with growing farm productivity and better metallurgy and crafts. This led to China's first Bronze Age territorial empire. So metal and farming together, once again, gave rise to cities. Shang and Zhou dynasties. Chinese history is organized into dynasties, ruling families. Two well-known Bronze Age dynasties were the Shang, 1600 to 1046 BCE, and the Zhou, 1046 to 256 BCE. So whenever you study China, remember it is a story of dynasty following dynasty, each ruling for a stretch of time. Iron Age, Qin and Han. By about 600 BCE, the use of iron became common across China, marking its Iron Age. The name China itself probably comes from the Iron Age Qin dynasty, 221 to 206 BCE, the first imperial dynasty, which is credited with unifying the country. It was followed by another great dynasty, the Han, 206 BCE to 220 CE. So the very word China carries the memory of the Qin. Zhou rulers, kings and priests. Here is an interesting idea about the Zhou rulers. They were seen as both kings and priests, believed to be appointees of heaven. But, and this is important, they could be dismissed if their people did not prosper. So even a heaven-appointed king had to rule well, or lose the right to rule. This was an early idea of accountability. Oracle bones. What is our earliest source of information about China? Surprisingly, the oracle bones. These were symbols carved on animal bones and tortoise shells, which were then heated until they cracked. The patterns of the cracks were interpreted to foretell the future. Today, these oracles tell us a great deal about the hopes, desires, and fears of the early Chinese. So their fortune-telling tools became our history books. Chinese logographic script. The Chinese script is logographic. Let me explain that word. The characters represent whole words or morphemes, the smallest units of meaning, not sounds as our alphabet does. So in Chinese, one symbol can stand for an entire word or idea, a very different system from ours, and one that is still used today. Jade, marble, and bronze crafts. The Chinese were superb craftsmen. They made prized jade objects and figurines, used as ritual or prestige items, and since jade came from outside China, it was especially valuable. They also carved marble into ornaments and pillar foundations, and mastered bronze metallurgy to make weapons, tools, and elaborate ritual vessels. So Chinese craftsmanship was rich, varied, and highly skilled. Musical jade. Here is a charming detail. Chinese artisans carved jade into shapes such as fish and tied them with a cord. And when struck, these jade pieces produced a clear, lasting musical sound. This shows two things at once: the importance of music in Chinese culture and the high level of craftsmanship they had achieved. Imagine making music from stone. The Great Wall of China. The famous Great Wall of China was not built all at once. It was built over a period stretching to nearly 2,000 years. Several separate walls, begun from about 680 BCE by the Zhou and other dynasties, were built to protect against raids by nomadic tribes, and were later joined together into one great defense. Repairs continued right up to the 17th century CE, so the Great Wall is really the work of many generations. Silk and the Silk Route. Silk was known to the Chinese from the Neolithic period and became an important craft in the Bronze Age. But around the 2nd century BCE, during the Han Dynasty, silk became such a major item of external trade that the entire trade route came to be known as the famous Silk Route. So a single beautiful cloth gave its name to one of history's greatest trade routes, the very route that connected China with India and the West. A stratified society. By about 1500 BCE, Chinese Bronze Age society was highly stratified, that is, sharply divided into classes. At the top were the ruling class, nobles and aristocrats, and below them, the farmers and laborers. This laid the foundation of the Chinese social structure that developed in later times. So, like Egypt and Mesopotamia, China too had a clear hierarchy. Money and firsts. China gave the world several remarkable firsts. A metal-based medium of exchange appeared during the Zhou dynasty, and a full money economy developed by the 5th century BCE. In fact, China was the first country to introduce paper currency and the first to develop a civil service through public examination. So many ideas we take for granted today, paper money, competitive exams, began in ancient China. Section 16. Summary and Exam Practice. Summary. Early Human History. Let us now tie the whole chapter together, children. Early human history is the long age before writing, and we study it mainly through tools, fossils, and cave art. Its central truth is simple. Humans evolved in Africa and gradually migrated to every corner of the world. Keep this as your one-line summary of the beginning. The Stone Age stages. Remember the 3 Stone Age stages in order. Paleolithic, hunter-gatherers using hand axes and cleavers. Mesolithic, small microliths and riverside camps. Neolithic, agriculture, villages, and pottery. Each stage brought new tools and a new way of life. If you can recall these 3 stages, you have the backbone of the chapter. Metals and civilization. Then came the metals. The Chalcolithic saw the first use of copper, and the Bronze Age brought urban centers, trade, writing, administration, and social organization. In short, metals powered the rise of civilization. So the discovery of metal is one of the great turning points in the human story. 4 River Valley civilizations. And finally, always remember the 4 great River Valley civilizations: Sindhu-Sarasvati, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China, which developed independently in fertile river valleys, yet each made great contributions to agriculture, writing, architecture, administration, and culture. Independent in origin, yet sharing common features. That is the beautiful pattern of early civilization.
Mesopotamia means land between rivers. The Sumerians built city-states, canals, mud brick houses, temples called ziggurats, and developed crafts, trade, carts, and sailboats.
Class 9 and 10 students, don't worry, make science and social science easy with your CBSE teacher. Subscribe now, like, comment, and press the bell.